really reflect on the learnings as well. Give yourself time to reflect on everything you're learning and really to that process of healthy skepticism. Use critical thinking, that when new information comes to you, have a process of asking some of those questions of, where is this coming from? Has this been validated? Do I have any other points to validate that this new information is relevant to me, is important to me? Have that process and build that skepticism into your process, into your reflection. I'm Petra Kis-Herczegh, and this is SEO in 2026.
Petra, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
My number one SEO tip for 2026 is for SEOs to really embrace their healthy skepticism. So in a time where the SEO industry is drowning in new AI metrics, from AI or attribution to vector index presence, we need to understand that we don't have robust standardized methods to validate these just yet. And when tools show you things like AI visibility, we should really start asking questions like, what's the sample size behind this? What's that number or percentages actually based on? How are these metrics defined? Can the tool that's providing me this metric is it actually using LLM training data, or are they reverse engineering the attribution models? I think to embrace healthy skepticism and use critical thinking isn't a new thing. It's not a new process. We had to use it before. But I think this situation makes it, again, really crucial. So, for example, previously as well, when featured snippets appeared, we had to completely rethink how we evaluate our existing Google Search Console data, because now it meant something different because of the change, and it was in a new context. We had to ask these questions before, and not just to chase new metrics, but how do we evaluate the data that we are basing decisions on? And I think part of the problem is that people are trying to look at these shiny new metrics as something that they can base decisions on, when actually these metrics might change in a month or two, because they are everyone's still collecting data, everyone's still looking at that attribution model, everyone's still trying to understand how these LLMs actually understand your website, do the vector embeddings and sort of understand the context and serve the answers. And the models change all the time as well, so that plays a part. So what I would say is that before we bet our credibility on a shiny new dashboard, we need to ask ourselves, what would I actually do differently with this data? Do I have any other way to validate this from something that I trust already, something that I know it's proven? And if you can't answer those questions, then we are really just chasing a hype instead of thinking critically. So
I guess the key question is knowing what data you can trust. Because in your initial phrase, embrace healthy skepticism, what's healthy, what's unhealthy? Should you question everything, or how do you know when you get to the point where you should stop questioning things?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess it will depend on a case-by-case basis. But, we do, I also think we should kind of challenge this saying of data doesn't lie. I think people really like to say that, and it's really untrue, in my opinion. Data does indeed lie, because data only actually means something when it's interpreted by us, by human beings, and in a specific context. And a lot of that can be very easily misinterpreted. And so therefore data often does lie. And, with data, we really need to understand, how was this collected? How was this processed? In what context was it collected in? Because then we can only make conclusions within that specific context, or we need to understand if it's generalizable to other contexts. So what's a healthy amount and how we need to question it? I think the key point here is to build processes that we can trust. That, again, the example I mentioned, how when featured snippets appeared, we had to rethink what the Google Search Console data mean. That's a process to evaluate the data that exists already, that we used to make decisions on, and we trust it because it's proven, because it provided results. But we can kind of use that as a starting step. How is this changing now? What does this mean? People are seeing, top of funnel data disappearing. What does this mean for the bottom line? Why is that happening? Are people having a lot of that conversation on LLMs? Is this a problem? But looking at the data that you're familiar with and you've used already is probably a really great starting point, and see if the sort of unproven metrics fit into that. Obviously, be aware of confirmation bias. You're not chasing an AI metric to fit your narrative, but you need to understand the level of robustness that these metrics have and compare them against each other.
So, what would be an example of a metric that you unquestionably trust? And what would be an example of a metric that you see many SEOs talking about and trusting, and you go, why are you trusting that? That's daft to trust that without questioning it.
Oh, I feel like this is not going to be an answer probably anyone likes, because I really don't trust data in general. I think like I always really want to understand the context the data is presented in. So I don't like generalizing from data points. I think to shortly answer this, the data that you can trust is when you're talking to an actual customer, when you're talking to an actual user and they tell you that they bought the product. Like, you can trust that, like that's a data point that you can trust. To kind of go back to things like Google Search Console, like things that you have multiple data points behind. So you're not just looking at data in isolation. I think that's crucial. And that's where I'm more confident. I don't like to use the word trust for these reasons, but I like to use the word confidence, right? So I could use my Google Search Console to look at, my impressions and clicks, and that can tell me a story. And I think that can be very misleading unless I'm also looking at analytics, unless I'm also looking at sales data, and I'm looking at maybe, a specific product and how is that performing. So kind of the more granular I can get with these things and look at them from different points of views, from different tools that give me the different data points, the more confidence I can get in like, okay, my question is, how is this new product that we launched performing? And then I can look at all those channels, and when they tell a similar story, that's when my confidence will be higher, basically.
I like the word confidence as well. I also like the word conviction as well. So building conviction in the story that your data is probably building for you, that you can then hopefully present to different stakeholders in the business. And you also talk about the different analytical skills that are required. How does an SEO develop the analytical skills that are required in order to be more successful in interpreting data?
Yeah, I think analytical skills are something where a huge part of it really is critical thinking and understanding the processes behind analytical skills. So understanding the data pipeline, right? Like the data collection, how does the data get processed? So collection, again, if we're looking at analytics, like what are the triggers that actually collect this data point when we talk about user visits? Like really just take any of your tools and try to dissect it, right? Try to investigate what a certain data point means. If you look at impressions, like what does that mean? How does Google collect it? But the reason why I mentioned analytics, because then you can talk to an analyst in your business, for example, and really ask like, what kind of triggers are on the website that collect that data point. Then we get into data processing, and then you can ask questions about, sampling and things like that. Like many people or many sort of more junior SEOs maybe wouldn't be aware that Google Search Console data is also sampled. And if you're dealing with a site that's millions of URLs and you have one Google Search Console property, then the sampling rate might be really high. And actually, that means that when you're trying to get really granular data, you might not be getting that very specific data, and you might need to set up additional Google Search Console properties. But that's kind of the second step of that. So really like look at that data lifecycle, because then you get into like, okay, based on how it was collected and how it was processed, now we need to look at how we are analyzing it. But when we are analyzing it within a context, that context has to match how it was collected. And it's also like, this is why when you set up a campaign or something and you want to create success measures, you have to define how you're going to collect that data, because you want to have that same question in mind, collecting the data to when you're going to be analyzing it. So you can't just like finish a campaign and kind of run around and try to collect different data points, because they might have been collected in totally different contexts. And I think probably a good starting point would be to look at your own website, look at your own Google Analytics, because then, or whatever analytics platform are you using. And if you have, analysts in the business or whoever set up your analytics tracking, talk to those people, try to understand that full process. That will really help you build out some of these skills to do that proper investigation.
And you also have an explain it to my friend test. What is that about?
Yes, I really like to use that with anything new I learn. I think it's a good sense check to see, are we just chasing new information, or are we actually like understanding what we are reading, what we are learning? So this is something that whenever you say you learn anything new and you're talking to others in the industry, also have a think like, how would I explain this to my friend? Because we might be just really familiar with jargon and we throw the same sentences around that we've heard and we've read on LinkedIn 15 times. Does that mean we actually understand it and we actually understand what it means to our business? If you can explain it to a friend, it means you can explain it to your CEO or your any other decision maker or stakeholder in the business. So yeah, when we're talking about like, I think vectors, like vector embeddings, that are vector index presence, are words that are being thrown around and as like new things, but are they new when we've been, talking about entities and the knowledge graph with regards to Google and that contextual understanding for a very long time? Of course, it's in a new context. But I think when you try to explain it to a friend, then you will try to find things that you can connect it with and things that how things relate. That will actually help you not just create better use cases in the business when you're explaining things, but it will mean that you understand it better. You understand the process behind it better as well, rather than just repeating what you've read a million times.
And of course, historically, SEOs have had a lot of excitement with data that didn't necessarily mean anything to the business. And you've got a so what principle that applies to data like that.
Yeah, I think again, it's a great principle to ensure that you're presenting the right things and you're trying to get buy-in for the right things as well. So we can get really excited about these new shiny things, and if you now see that in a new tool, your AI visibility is really high, or you see a really nice metric, then you might feel compelled, or really bad, you might feel compelled to present it because it's either, a huge, like you flag it as a huge risk or a really good thing that you've done. But what does it actually mean? Like beyond the fact, is this data point even valid and robust enough? Let's say you validated that and you see a really great number. You have to be able to explain the so what principle, like which just means like, why should anyone care about this? What does this actually mean to the business? And what's the decision that you would make on this? What's the suggestion that you're saying, instead of just really focusing on the number? And I think within the industry, and especially people who do like data and who do like analytics, have a tendency to, focus so much on creating that really nice chart that tells a story, that forget about the why should anyone care part.
And in terms of why anyone should care, and if you're an SEO perhaps doing a presentation in the business to different stakeholders, you also advocate not being concerned if the answer is I don't know. If you don't know necessarily what the story is behind the data or whether or not you trust the data, it's actually a strength, you say, to actually admit that you're not necessarily completely reliant on the data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really is a superpower to become confident with saying just I don't know, because especially with these new AI metrics, and based on the conversation as well that we had today, I'm not suggesting that we are not looking at these metrics. Just to be clear, right? I'm suggesting we have the skepticism, and this is why that was the start of my tip. So because a lot of the time we have to experiment with these things, and we have to indeed look at the metrics, and we will be asked questions, so we have to present them. But if we can present them in the context of this is experimental, it's not valid, like there are not these standard methods yet to validate anything, then you're really showing that you truly understand at the stage that this metric is in. And you can say to questions, I don't know, because we are not there yet. Actually, probably no one knows, or, if anyone will know, I will see it on LinkedIn when, people who are chasing these publish new results. And you will create more trust as well if people know that you will tell them when you don't know something, and you can also provide this, I don't know, but this is how I will go about sort of finding it out, or I don't know because this doesn't exist yet, but when it exists, I will likely hear about it because I follow the right sort of people, the right news, the right newsletters, whatever it is, the right information channels. And that gives, I think, really good confidence to other stakeholders in the business that they can trust you because you're not going to essentially BS them, right?
Petra, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
I would say that the key takeaway is to really reflect on the learnings as well. Give yourself time to reflect on everything you're learning and really to that process of healthy skepticism. Use critical thinking that when new information comes to you, have a process of asking some of those questions of, where is this coming from? Has this been validated? Do I have any other points to validate that this new information is relevant to me, is important to me? Have that process and build that skepticism into your process, into your reflection.
Petra Kis-Herczegh is a strategic consultant at Chameleon Journal. Find out more over at chameleonjournal.com. Petra, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.